Functions are the essential building blocks for any software engineering field. But first, let's understand what is a function, why we need it, and how to use it. Let's first analyze that from a human perspective. You as a human, you have the ability to speak, you have the ability to walk, and you have other abilities as well. The question is, let's take the example of walking. Are you constantly walking? Always walking? No. But you have that ability where you can execute it, your brain can execute it to work once needed. Probably you're sitting on a chair and you need some item over the table. So your brain trigger a signal somehow to your legs to start moving, or to your muscles to start moving and take that item and come back to the chair. Probably that's an example. So the functionality of moving towards the chair or changing the muscles and moving towards the chair, it's a function executed on demand. You're not always walking. And the same concept applied in programming. We have certain actions, we don't want to run them always. We want to run them only when we need them. For instance, sending an email. Are you always sending an email? No. You send an email once you click on the send button. So that's a function. Another example, you're playing a music. Always are you playing music? Of course not. If you go to YouTube and visit any video, well, of course, when you land on the page, on a specific video, it will automatically play. But you can stop that, right? And that stop is a function. All right? So I hope you can see now where we are going. So functions are everywhere in our applications. And functions can help us to reduce code duplication, maintain better code quality, and separate concerns from each other. So instead of having one big file as doing everything, you separate that file into smaller functions. And that's the beauty of functions. Now, let's take a real example from coding perspective. Let's say we want to have an array of items and then we want to sum them up, but only once we need that. We don't want to sum them up immediately once the page is loaded, for example. So how to do that? Well, first let's create the array as we learned before. Var numbers equal, I'm gonna put 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Now I want to have a function that I want to call it at any time later, not once the page is loaded. And that function is its responsibility of calculating the sum of these numbers and printing that to the console. All right, so to define a function, so in functions world, we have two steps. Define a function and then call it later on. To define a function, we use in JavaScript, there are several ways to define a function. One of them is using the keyword function. So function, and then we provide the function name. The function name should match what it does. So don't call it X or Y or some silly names. Call it exactly what it does. So the function here, it's doing calculation over those numbers. So we say calculate numbers. Calculate total sum of numbers. Okay, it's a long name, but it explains exactly what it does. And you should follow that always. All right, and then we have open closing parentheses, and then open closing curly braces. Well, I think you're familiar now with this structure of having open closing and then something here to write in between. So here we want to perform the sum logic. All right, and to do so we can use the previous method, numbers.forEach, and then number, and then we probably have a variable here called total sum equals 0 initially, and then total sum plus equal the number. This is a shortcut, right? And then what we want to do is to console log that total sum. That's what we requested at the beginning. So we define the function, and then now we want to call it. But first, before we call it, let's go back to the browser and see if we have anything to the console. All right, so if we go to console, let's refresh, and we have nothing, right? Let me open this in private window so I think we can get a clear console, not every time with that ugly warnings. So here, as you can see, we are printing out to the console, but we have nothing. Why is that? Well, the reason, as we said earlier, a function is a piece of code that does something but can be executed on demand, and we are not executing it. We didn't call it yet. And in order to call a function, you use this syntax. So you take the name of the function and then you add this syntax to it, open closing parentheses, and then semicolon. That means we are calling the function, and then whatever logic inside it, it will be executed. All right, let's verify that. I'm gonna save this and come back and refresh. Well, I see 01. What is that? Sorry, this is number, not numbers. Sorry for the mistake. So here, if we refresh, we should see 10. And that's the sum of 1, 2, 3, 4. That's correct. So now, if we remove this, we will not have that 10 anymore because we are not calling it. Okay? Now, probably here you are asking, well, this is not very useful. Give me a real example. Well, a real example might be if you have a button here on the page, and that button is responsible of calling that function. So when we click on that button, we want to calculate the total numbers. When we click on the send button, we send an email. When we click on the exit here, we close that tab. These are functions defined already by previous developers. So the same concept here we are doing. We want to have a button, and then when we click on it, we want to print out the sum to the console. All right, how to do that? You don't need to worry about having the button now in HTML. Don't worry about that. I just have a button here called calculate sum. Calculate. If we refresh, we will have that button, and we want, when we click on that, we want to have that number printed to the console. Well, since we have the function, well, of course, we don't want to call it once the page is loaded. So let's remove this. We want to call this function only once we click on that button. And in HTML, we can provide this onClick attribute or onClick event, and then we pass the name of the variable of the function with the same way we did it before. So we are calling that function only once when we click on that button. If this syntax doesn't make sense for now, it's okay. You don't need to worry about it. You just need to worry about the creation of the function and how to call it. Let's save it and come back here. As expected, we have nothing printed to the console, and we have this calculate sum button. Now, if we click it, we should see the value printed to the console. Boom. I click that. Now we have 10. If I click it again, I have 10 again printed to the console. And you can see here how many times printed to the console. So if I keep clicking, it will print the same value again and again and again. So this is functions in JavaScript in a nutshell.